Okay, I would now like to turn over the program to Shala Headwall and Jamie Sanderlin, who will be leading us in a panel discussion. Shala, can you hear me?
I can hear you, and hopefully you can hear me now that I turned off my mute.
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Welcome, hola, buenas tardes. I'm so glad to have everyone here today. My name is Shala Headwall, and I'm a senior fish and wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And myself and Jamie Sanderlin are going to be facilitating and participating in a panel discussion regarding the complexity of managing for wildlife and fire. So big topic. The goal of this panel discussion is to start a dialogue around the challenges of managing for fire and wildlife, particularly under the ever-increasing pressures that we're all feeling to increase pace and scale and put more fire on the landscape. So for the next half hour or so, after introductions, Jamie Sanderlin and I are going to facilitate this dialogue with our panelists that is intended to spark questions and dialogue from you all. And so after we have about 35 minutes of discussion, there'll be about 20 minutes at the end for you to ask questions of the panelists following the discussion. Now, this is a big topic, like I said, and there's a diversity of topics that we could cover under that title. This is, as I said, intended to be a starting point and to start generating conversation about what more in-depth presentations or webinars over the course of the next year you all may want to see regarding different topics. So before we begin, I'm going to have each of our panelists briefly introduce themselves. So please all make sure your cameras are on, panelists. And I'll start with my co-facilitator, Jamie Sanderlin.
Hello, my name is Jamie Sanderlin, and I am a quantitative ecologist with Rocky Mountain Research Station of the U.S. Forest Service. And we are part of the research branch of the Forest Service. And we can go on to, let's say, Brian.
Hello, everyone. I'm Brian Nowicki with the Center for Biological Diversity. I work on forest and wildlife issues throughout the Southwest, although I am physically based in Albuquerque. And been working with a lot of the folks on this call for a while now. So it is good to see you all. I think, Shala, I should hand it back to you because
Excellent. Yeah, so let's start next with Scott Gillespie.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Scott Gillespie. I'm the Fuels AFMO on the Safford Ranger District, Coronado National Forest. My background is 27 years in fire and fuels and currently working on a large landscape scale NEPA project to treat close to 190,000 acres of forest land in about 9 different fuel types. So that's where we're at today.
That in itself could be a webinar, right?
Yes.
And last, but definitely not least, Mike Ubel.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Mike Ubel. I'm the Prescribed Fire and Fuels Manager for the south end of the Kaibab National Forest in northern Arizona. And my job is to put fire back on the landscape and work with multiple specialists to take those competing objectives and come to one common vision.
Excellent. Barbara, are we okay? I thought maybe you. We will do our best. Feel free to remind us as we move forward. All right, so one of the things we kind of wanted to kick off, and Mike, since I'm looking at your picture right now, is what's working well in terms of incorporating wildlife into fire management decisions. Before we get into our biggest challenges, what are you seeing success with?
Well, I think fortunately, there's a lot of successes that we're seeing when it comes to fire managers and wildlife managers working together. I think one of the big things that I've seen over the last few years with the accelerated restoration that the Southwest has taken on is the support for additional survey. The wildlife programs in the past have been small and taxed with a lot of stuff to do with few people, and they've gotten a lot of support to find ways to add to their capacity so they can get out there and do the survey and get that information that a lot of times in the past we were just missing. We just didn't know what was out there. So it's really hard to manage for something when you don't really know what's out there to manage for. And then there's a lot of great things that get found. You might be looking for one species or information, and then there's a lot of new things you find out there. So it gives land managers a lot more opportunity to manage for the whole and not just a species, but find common operating pictures that manage for multiple species. So I think that's one of the good things there, Shala, that we've seen that's working well.
Brian, in your mind, what do you see that's working well?
I'm gonna follow up on Mike's comment right there and second it. I guess it speaks a lot to thank you for having this workshop over these next 2 days, because it goes to my point, which is that we're asking a lot. First of all, we're asking a lot of a difficult bureaucracy that we all have to work with. We all have a lot of requirements on us. And secondly, in particular, we're asking a lot of our fire managers and fire crews to get out there and implement a lot of different criteria, a lot of different needs, interests, outcomes. And what's working well, in my opinion, and this is coming from somebody outside of the agencies and has to work with the agent through various processes, direct conversations and then comment processes, is where we're opening up the conversations to get the input as much as possible, get all of the ideas out there on the front end so that they can be essentially presented to the guys who actually have to go out there, guys and girls who have to go out there and do and implement the fire, our fire management out there. And so it's absolutely critical we do that ahead of time, number one, and also that we have as much information and interests and perspectives at the table and then present it in a way that can actually be useful to those fire guys and gals when they go out there to start the fires. So in my opinion, some examples to look at, I mean, Forefry has some great forest restoration initiative, has some great conversations going on. It's a lot though. It's a lot of information and a lot to ask of fire management officers to distill into management criteria. So other processes where we can further distill it to make it as easy as possible for folks to use.
I will say, and I just want to add to that since I get to participate with you all as well. In my experience, most of the fire managers I work with, to be honest, are better at incorporating multiple resource objectives into their planning than even a lot of the other resource groups, biologists included. And it's one thing I think fire's been in that position for a long time where, it's feast or famine, and now it's pushing into feast. But I'd be curious, Scott, and have you add to that conversation too about what's working before we jump into challenges. I think you guys do a great job, guys and gals, implementing those resource objectives when we clearly define them for you. Any thoughts? At least in terms of the wildlife and what we want to see in the ground.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a multifaceted question from your perspective, Shala, but from my perspective also, What's working as opposed to maybe 8 or 10 years ago is that we're doing a better job with everybody coming to the table early on. And I see a lot more alignment with people wanting to do something. In the past, that wasn't the case. There was a lot of resistance, even within our own agency and other agencies. So I see us all at the table with more of a common mission, although we have all have our own specialties or areas of concern. Folks are wanting to come together and get some stuff done. The other success on our end is the funding and the operational side is getting quite a bit easier to put fire on the ground. I say that caveat that nothing's easy, but it's easier. So hopefully that helps answer that question for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jamie, you want to add anything in terms of successes?
Yeah, I want to speak to the relationship part, because I think when it comes down to it, we're working with people, and it's building those relationships and finding the common ground to move forward. And I've seen a lot of positive steps in those directions of getting folks together, like this webinar series, but, the in-person meetings, and finding where that common ground. So I'd say that is one thing that's working well. And of course, we could always do better, but I think we gotta find those nuggets of positive.
Yeah, and in thinking about, one of the things that seems to come up a lot when we're thinking about wildlife and fire is the differences in terms of how we sometimes put prescribed fire on the ground versus when we're dealing with wildfire. And Scott and Mike too, what do you guys see as different challenges between prescribed fire and wildfire when you're dealing with wildlife resource objectives?
I guess I'll start there, Mike. There's a lot more room for opportunity and decision in prescribed fire, which is a good thing and can be a challenge, because then it opens up the door more for all possibilities, and it's easier for us to get lost in all of those possibilities and making sure everything comes out perfect. Where as opposed to managing a wildfire, there's less time for that, or less opportunity for that. And I think people are more acceptable to lesser than desirable results. And again, a double-edged sword. I'm not saying right, wrong, or indifferent, but I'm just saying there's people do understand that, manage wildfire situation, you have lesser time for those options. But I also see the challenge on that side, that the expectation for us is that managed wildfire from some folks is also, they expect the same outcome as a wildfire or as a prescribed fire. And they look at it as we made that decision and everything's in our control. So.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. That hit the nail on the head for sure. That plan versus the unplanned events. It's funny, it's all fire, but it does get looked at differently from all angles. And I would just add to it the one thing about when you're managing a wildfire for multiple objectives, even though it's generally allowed to be a little more loose, a little more acceptable of a variety of outcomes than that planned event. There's still opportunity there potentially to do what's right on that particular landscape. If you do have a very specific wildlife habitat objective you're trying to meet, it doesn't mean you got to throw everything out the door and not meet that objective. there is potential. The nice thing about the wildfire site is sometimes it's easier to get more help, and in the financial side of it's a little easier. You can get more folks there to maybe, do prep or do something a little different, where we get restrained a little bit more in prescribed fire. So there's still opportunity, but fire is always a coarse tool over a large landscape, and you're always going to have a variety of effects there.
Scott, you made a really interesting, and I think it's interesting to me because it's something that challenges me a lot, but that difference between, there probably is no perfect result ever, right? Because fire is an imprecise tool. I mean, I think sometimes it does better than we think it's going to do, and sometimes we get not the effects we want. But perfect versus that less desirable, I think sometimes bridging that gap is more about communication than even the actual implementation. Brian, Scott, Mike, do you guys want to comment on that? I think sometimes that's our biggest, some of the social and communication issues are almost bigger issues than how you're going to deal with putting fire on the ground.
I can respond to that just real briefly, Shala, in that I hear from my members and from my allies exactly what you all are describing, which is that if it happened during a wildfire, they has a lot more leeway given to what the effects are, as opposed to if what happens during a prescribed managed fire. And sometimes that's perplexing to me, but it is also, a second point that I would ask to make here when we're talking about challenges is that I've actually seen more of the opposite in what I have, in the fires that I've been involved with and tracking over the past few years. And that is that, during wildfire, that there's less deference given to the wildlife requirements, the wildlife needs that otherwise would be baked into the thinking. Well, whether the outcome, now we're not talking about outcomes, because you never know once you light the fire and start a prescribed fire, different things can happen, and you have a range of outcomes on the ground. But what we see is that during wildfires, a lot of wildlife habitat needs sometimes take a second seat. And here, I'd be remiss if I didn't channel my colleague Robin Silver for a moment to say that feels that one of the worst places, the worst examples of where that happened would be Mount Graham, where a backfire went and was deliberately lit during a wildfire, but then went into the red squirrel habitat. And it was something that, if thought about and discussed ahead of time, we would hope would not have been the decision that would have been made, and certainly not the outcome that anybody would have wanted. Shala?
No, I think that was really good. And I would just add, Mike and Scott, and just kind of getting back to that, either response to Brian, either one of you want to get on that, but I think it's because we're still stuck with not always having the best monitoring plans or even objectives in place, that I'm still kind of stuck on how we, and Molly hit on this in her introduction, how do we know when we're getting it right? I mean, perfect is sort of not really attainable. We want to meet objectives. We don't have to meet them everywhere. So how do you guys think about that? Whether it's the wildfire example Brian just gave with, maybe putting fire in the wrong place at the wrong time, not saying it was, just saying maybe that's what happened. How do you guys think about that? And you can just use fire in general. It doesn't have to be prescribed or wild, or you can pick. But it'd be nice, I think, to kind of have a little more conversation about that. I think everybody thinks we can just put fire out there. I'll try and simplify this. And we're going to get what we want. And we know that's not the case. Some places we're going to get what we want, other places we're not. And that's, how do you move forward with that, Mike and Scott?
I'll give the first stab, Scott. I think the last one, and great point there, Brian, for sure. So obviously it's a really complex topic to go through when you're talking about just wildfire in general. You know, and it sounded like the example Brian was talking about is like that summertime wildfire that's burning in a time that naturally wildfire or fire wouldn't be burning. So it's burning hotter and faster than you'd want to. You're not able to meet objectives. So those type of fires get taken over. And even though they're still competing objectives, a lot of time life and property is the main objective that incident management teams end up trying to manage for. And so it's not ideal, and things come out not always how we would want to. And I don't have a great answer for how to fix that or what to do about that, Shaw. All I can say is that's why we all have to be a proponent for getting fire on the landscape when the time is right, whether it's prescribed fire or it's managing wildfire for multiple objectives when conditions, you know, fuel moistures or whatever conditions are driving you to meet objectives a little better. And the more we take advantage of those opportunities, get more fire on the landscape that way, then that's less opportunities that we have to sit and have these tough discussions of the wildfire when we don't want it and we can't really control it. And the life and property objective takes over a little more than we'd want it to where we're setting, you know, we're trying to stop the fire with fire and those type of tactics that sometimes don't give us the objectives that are beneficial to wildlife.
Yeah, I can definitely agree and appreciate both Brian and Mike's perspective there. What to tag on to that would be that there is a better culture within the fire suppression side, I think, that I've been seeing over the last 10 plus years, where there is more ownership, even in a wildfire scenario, to try to minimize negative wildfire effects. Although those become, you know, they get big, cumbersome, the more people you have involved in that fire, the more room for error, the more for misinterpretation, the slower things move, opportunities get missed. But there's a better acceptance, in my opinion, to look for those positive opportunities in every fire situation now. Maybe how I could put that into perspective here, one place that is challenging or a goal that we've been going for here is to try to take some of those big ticket items out of the equation early on. So be more specific. There was a talk earlier about competing priorities and social political issues. When you're talking about a structure or those hardcore values that have a dollar figure to them, the reality is there is those political pressures, whether it be, you know, that group or senators or congressmen or whatever that are putting pressure on the ICs and on the Forest Service agent administrators, take care of my thing, you know, and it can easily get brought to the top before a wildlife issue could, and then that wildlife habitat can sometimes take that loss. You know, the thing that we've been trying to do here is, hey, if we can, let's treat around that value now, so that when the wildfire comes, we don't have to focus on that value, that hard value, that structure. We can now focus our time and effort and energy on that wildlife value out on the ground. So that's one tactic that we've been trying to do here that maybe would help us in the future.
Yeah, I agree. I think those are really good points. The one other thing I would add for both prescribed and wildfire that seems to have worked really well over the last 20 years is co-developing objectives pre-fire, pre-implementation. I'm not talking NEPA, talking getting out with fire and having a conversation about what do we want to do on this piece of ground? How are we going to do it? And this is what we'd like to see. How can you fire help us get there? I think that's been super effective. That actual face-to-face communication on the ground, pre-ignition.
So I want to jump in with a challenge from my perspective, coming from the research perspective, I say is monitoring, because the importance of monitoring for communication to the public is vital. We need to be able to measure those effects. So having data pre-activity and post-activity is important to show what are those effects on the ground, and having standardized data across spatial scales, across time, so that we can look at those effects and having the power to detect those effects. So enough sample size on the ground with monitoring data. So in my mind, those are a few of the challenges to get at some of the communication pieces and what actions are needed to go forward, and use a database approach to do that.
So Jamie, I mean, this has been the holy grail for so long, and I know we all really want it. What do you see the potential for us to actually have databases that we share that we can use across agencies? And even across borders. So with Mexico.
Yeah, that's really getting at the crux. You know, what is the issue and how do we move forward? And I know we've had discussions from the Mexican spotted owl perspectives of how we do this in a standardized way, multiple partners. We started that conversation, but I think it's still in progress about how to move forward. I don't have all the answers in that perspective, but what are your thoughts there, Shala?
Brian, I'm going to let Brian weigh in on this one.
I'm going to second what both Jamie's and Shala's points over this past few minutes. And cross borders, Shala, is not just across the international border. Sometimes it means across forest boundaries, and in those certain special places across district boundaries. It all depends on at what scale things are being planned, and obviously nobody here hopefully would argue that we need to be planning at landscape scales for some of these fire uses. So I'm gonna throw out my pet. This shows you how old and kind of sad I've become. This is my dream. This is one of my dreams. My dream here is that we have fire management plans that are living, breathing documents that are updated with data and a fully funded system to bring that monitoring data into them on an annual basis. And also that they're going through constant review and a NEPA process, so that there's public input, with the idea being it provides the transparency to the public. It provides that public outreach and communication tool that we need to like Shala was mentioning before, just letting people understand what the plans are. It allows for more inclusiveness and a broader perspective in the development of fire management plans. And most importantly, perhaps it provides a explicit and operationally relevant decision matrix for when an incident is happening. And that would be, a map of dominant fire management objectives, those areas where showing what the different objectives are. We have a lot of this already in place, but to be able to continually update that with what fires have happened and what changes have happened on the ground. And of course, near and dear to my heart, where the important wildlife habitats are that require special consideration and special management, both for ahead of when a fire is happening, and then when an unexpected, I guess there's no such thing as an unexpected fire at this point, when an unplanned fire is occurring, so that when the incident team comes in, that there is an explicit decisions that they can look at to help guide them in that moment of crisis. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Those are all really good thoughts, Brian. There's a lot to unpack in the monitoring issue, and I hope that we have a lot more discussion over the next year on that. Scott and Mike, you guys have any additional thoughts on monitoring, or what monitoring you do, or how fire might be able to help us set up some sort of monitoring protocol that we could actually implement across similar vegetation types or other? I would love to hear briefly some of your ideas on the monitoring issue. It can be brief.
I'll go first on this one, Mike. Well, it is a challenge. I think our agency struggles with that, with capacity. I think I'll take it a little different direction, though, that I think we struggle coming to common ground on what's valuable. What is valuable information? I think we have some valuable information that that's years old, decades old, that's out there that we tend to forget about, and we tend to always try to reinvent the wheel and coming up with something new, and it's already right there in front of us, and it just hasn't been signed off by somebody with the right title. Sometimes the data is right there. So I'd like us to use some more data we have does not necessarily have to be backed up by a university stamp or something. There's data there that I think we just miss constantly. And then, like I said, I do think too, we struggle to get to what really is valuable. So that's more of an open-ended question. There's a lot of difference in opinion on what that monitoring should look like, and so streamlining that somehow, and I don't have a good answer for that. I'll hand it to Mike.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think Shala, one of the things, I mean, it is one thing for the fire managers to think about it and maybe have an idea of monitoring. But I think this is one of those places too that our wildlife folks or our stakeholders or our researchers and scientists maybe can help guide what monitoring, what data is really important that would help lead to decisions on the grounds. Because, Scott's right, there's a lot of stuff that's probably already out there that maybe doesn't get used right or isn't understood. I don't know, but maybe if we could have good focus on what information would really make a difference, and then we can concentrate on getting that. Because probably one of the reasons the Forest Service isn't real good at monitoring in general is all the perspectives of what's important. And so you do get maybe a fuels crew is trying to get some information, and some wildlife biologists are getting some, and the local university is doing something, and we're not maybe focusing in on what's really important, and then getting our efforts together to get that information and share it so we can make decisions off of it.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things when we're increasing pace and scale, our monitoring needs to be responsive to that pace, right? And so even though people want to squeeze critters and we always want to measure like long living species, sometimes some of the best things that we could possibly measure are habitat related and things that can feed back. I'm not saying we don't monitor other things, but I agree with you that a lot of times, people want to monitor the really hard thing, and there's a lot of opportunity to monitor, tree survival, density, canopy cover. We have great tools now with LiDAR and everything else at our fingertips. We could do a much better job communicating to the public what the results and our coworkers, what the results of our treatments are on the ground. And I think part of this panel, discussion is to kind of kick off for everybody else to think about, where do we go next? Where do we want to pull that information together? And what do you really need, everybody out there, to help move the needle? And moving the needle means not just increasing the pace and scale of fire, but increasing our ability to show that we're getting what we want on the ground, that we are to our best ability possible, maintaining the things we want to maintain. And that's all with climate change on top of us, which is changing the game every year for what fire effects are, how big our burn window is, all of those things. So I think, it'd be great to have the panel, each one of you kind of give a little closeout on challenges, tools, or where you see things going, or even a suggestion for what you think might be good learning moving forward, because I think we're almost out of our time. So, Jamie, you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. So I recognize the need for information, and it needs to be fast because things are happening fast on the ground. And the way that I've been thinking about it is, how can we build systems that incorporate monitoring information, that incorporate our objectives, that incorporate the modeling aspect, and then the feedback, the adaptive management, but that whole adaptive management process that's fast, and how we build that system. So we have increased our capacity with a user interface developer to help at the research station, because we recognize that the model information is just not coming fast enough to act on with decisions. But one of the projects, another project that I'm involved with, is looking at birds across U.S. Forest Service regions 1, 2, 3, and 4, using a standardized data set and building a system that we can feed back that information with the wildfire crisis strategy. So that's just one thing I'd like to mention in closing out.
Brian, you want to close out next?
I don't think I have anything more to add from what I've already, I made sure to hit my main points and I had a chance to speak earlier, so I don't. Having conversations like this and showing how important this multi-agency, multi-party discussion is absolutely critical. But of course, as Jamie and I think everybody already mentioned, having it culminate into something that's actually operational. The point isn't just for talking, it's what kind of products can come out of these so that they can actually be used starting tomorrow or yesterday, and updated, unfortunately, continuously, given the changing baseline that we're all working with. Thanks all for having me.
Thanks, Brian. Scott or Mike? Mike, you want to go next? We'll let Scott have the last word.
Okay, I think my closing thoughts with this are, and it came up a couple times earlier today, it's the communication side. So first, I think for the success to be able to have wildlife and fire work together on the ground is you got to have that communication. It's always going to be the most important piece to success that we're going to have. And that, it starts at the fire manager and the biologist on the local unit, on the local project, talking, understanding, and then that expands out to the things like we're doing right now with this workshop. And this panel is put together as a great panel because it really does represent the folks we need to all be talking with. We have the research scientific side. We have Brian's folks who are focused in on critical pieces of information that we could be talking to and understanding, in Fish and Wildlife Service with Shala. So keep communicating, talk about the challenges. Don't be afraid of the challenges. Come together to find the common operating picture of those challenges, and that will lead to the success of us being able to continue to manage the landscape the way we're all supposed to do. It's all you, Scott.
Man, you guys didn't leave me much. I did jot down a few notes as you guys were talking. So challenges moving forward from my perspective. Generally, I think Jamie was talking about the speed of things. The speed at which we're moving is a challenge. We all, we're all part of that, wanting to move faster. But can we move faster and sustain that over time? I don't know. There's a lot of things coming at us rapidly. The amount of corporate knowledge we're losing out of the Forest Service, to be specific, in the fire and prescribed fire realm. Me and Mike and myself are getting pretty close to the end of our career. There's a huge gap from us to the younger guys and gals, and that prescribed fire experience. I'm hoping that we can bring them along and they can become better than us, but there's a huge gap, and at this pace and scale, I'm pretty concerned at what that looks like when it comes to staffing. And that kind of ties just into field experience. In any of our professions, there is a rush to bring people in, move them up, and they start making decisions from any of our specialties that just really don't have a lot of ground experience. I think all of us are seeing that turnover. So I think that's a challenge, but also an opportunity for us to find some common ground. And I am seeing that as a good starting point. One other specific challenge with wildlife, and let's get specific about threatened and endangered species. The jurisdiction of us, specifically, the Forest Service. Okay, we manage the land, and that land promotes the wildlife and everything coming off it. But the management of that wildlife is the Arizona Game and Fish, which is a different agency. And then how Fish and Wildlife Service ties in with that, specifically when it's a T&E species, in those layers, and again trying to drive those folks in a common direction. So I want to keep that. It is a challenge, but I also see us currently in our project, we've done a really good job moving to where we are, getting to where we are, all coming to the table, instead of a back and forth conversation. So I think those are the challenges moving forward.
And Andy, I have a minute to just close out.
Please.
I want to thank Mike, Scott, Brian, and of course Jamie for co-facilitating and participating in this. You guys are all people I greatly respect in terms of this subject, and I think everyone on this call has a lot to learn from all of you. So thank you for sharing, albeit brief, a little bit of your knowledge and expertise regarding this issue. I also want to say, and just emphasize, both Mike and Scott made this point, let's not recreate the wheel. I've been working in fire and wildlife for 30 years, and we know a lot. When we work together, I think we do great work. And when I mean we, I mean all of us, our publics, our NGOs, land management agencies, but we tend to be our own worst enemies sometimes. And I think, as we think about the discussion and the dialogue this next year, let's talk about what we need to increase those relationships and that process moving forward, because I agree with Mike and Scott that we know a lot of what we need to know. It's a lot of our process and procedure that sometimes really can get in the way of us having the productive conversations we need to have to both return fire as a disturbance regime to fire adapted systems and to promote the wildlife that we all care so much about. So thank you all very, very much. Greatly appreciate your participation and looking forward to questions.
Yay. Round of applause. Thank you. I just wanted to say I'm going to turn it over to Jessica here in a minute to take some good old-fashioned live questions, as well as a lot of information that has come into the chat box. Thank you to the panel. We do continue to have people joining. So as a reminder, please keep your microphones on mute and choose your language at the bottom of the screen, because we do have a Spanish channel for those of you who prefer to speak in Spanish. Okay, Jessica, take it
Thank
away.
you. Sure, we had some great comments and questions in the chat, so feel free to peruse for the full detail. I think we'll take live questions in just a moment. We had a few thoughts come in around collaboration, and I'll read a couple of those questions, some on climate change and the sort of long time scale, and then several thoughts about databases, data sets that are already working well or that could be improved. So we'll begin with collaboration. We have about 20 minutes for this Q&A session. Someone said, I'd like to hear how specialists are considering or applying traditional ecological or indigenous knowledge, or if tribes are allowing this information to be applied in your work, especially considering wildlife habitat, which may or may not be something you have experience to share on.
So I can talk a little bit about working with tribes to implement burns in different areas. And absolutely, I mean, tribes are sovereign nations. They put together those plans. We assist where we can. So on tribal lands, that is happening across the Southwest. The Mescalero Apache, the San Carlos Apache, multiple other tribes have had pretty rigorous programs in place for a long time in terms of fire. And I think those are all programs we can learn from. It might be something to think about from having some of those entities present in the future. For areas off tribal land, we try to work with, and I know the land management agencies do as well, to work with our tribal partners who consider those areas part of their indigenous heritage to implement, different activities where it is identified. Some of the tree species on the rim are good examples of where tribes are working with the Forest Service to maintain different oak species across an area. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think there's lots to get out of that question.
And if others would like to chime in the chat, please feel free.
I can add on to that one specifically from the Forest Service perspective. Generally speaking, we involve the tribes in our NEPA process and some discussions when we're moving forward with prescribed fire. When it comes to prescribed fire, they've been, they've traditionally done that, so they support it. And they just support like, hey, moving forward with it most of the time. But there is a re-emphasis on that, specifically with the Emery Oak initiative. So we're kind of going back to the table a little bit of that and then saying, hey, what does a healthy Emery Oak stand look like? So just some re-engagement directly with the tribe and getting some of their knowledge. So yes, that has been happening, and I feel like we're doing an even better job.
I think we'll move into a couple of related questions on climate change. How are your plans and prescriptions incorporating future climate impacts to mitigate effects to habitats that are not being faced today, but what will be faced 50 to 100 years from now, setting up habitat for success in future climates?
I'll give a quick stab at that one. That's a pretty challenging question for a land manager, but certainly something we need to be looking at. You know, I guess if I look at it with like my program, I'm not necessarily writing a plan today with 100% thought process of what 50 to 100 years look out at. But we are looking at the state of the habitat today, tomorrow, and in the future, because sometimes you can do something today for the benefit of the future. So it might not look as great today and tomorrow, but in a year or 10 years, you're going to be building it to where you want it to be. So I mean, we do think about it. The prescribed fire plans are reviewed yearly. So we don't ever get ourselves into like a prescription where we're going to set it and forget about it. It's always being reviewed. We review those with our specialists. We also review those with other entities like the state game department or Fish and Wildlife Service. So whoever might be affected by it, the best we can do in the moment is be willing to adapt and learn. And then when we are implementing, a key piece of that is getting lessons learned. Don't implement and walk away from it. Implement and learn and discuss what happened so that you can start preparing for maybe what you haven't seen in the last 20 years. So you're a little bit more aimed for what's going to happen in the next 20 years.
Would anyone like to add from the panel or from the participants?
Shala, are you really not going to pick that up?
Go for it.
And I see Pepe is gonna throw into that too. I guess one brief point, and that is, I have been party to some processes where the agencies and the multi-stakeholder group try to accomplish everything with their plan. And I think that mostly doesn't serve wildlife and our long-term habitat planning. I think that there are some very obvious needs for addressing fire at landscape scales. We'd like to see the Center for Biological Diversity very much promotes in the Southwest the idea of an optimization approach to what can we do in the short term to create the best scenario for restricting the possibility of long runs of high severity fire that would thus cut off corridors, migratory habitat, and climate migration options for species if you have those big and high severity fires. But that you don't have to accomplish everything on every acre, and that every project doesn't have to accomplish everything. I think the fire is an issue that touches everything, but we also need to address the fire separately in some ways from all of these, or we also need to address the habitat criteria separate from these larger scale fire demands.
Let me one thing, I mean, I'm not related to that a little bit, but this idea, one of the things that struck me, what Scott said, is this idea that there's a lot of people about to retire, especially from the fire side of the agencies, and there's going to be a lot of knowledge lost with that retirement. That actually, one of the things about this workshop that we're trying to do is we're trying to set up webinars coming up in the future. And so it kind of struck me that one of the ways that we could preserve this knowledge before it leaves the agency is perhaps presentations by these managers of what they've seen over the years. Because I mean, it would be hard for me or anybody to write a report like and tell somebody, hey, because ideally this is what I would do is say, before you retire, can you write a report of what you've seen in the last 25 years? But nobody's going to do that. So maybe a presentation would be a way to archive that knowledge for at least some of these managers, because I think that you're right that some of this knowledge, once it's gone, it's gone. And I think that that's a problem with a lot of the agencies, not just in terms of retirement, but in terms of turnover. People come and go from locations and you lose that knowledge. And so somehow perhaps, we could get a manager or a group of managers to team up with somebody to present this knowledge and that way we can store it in a webinar, and that managers as they come into the Southwest or to a specific region, they can look at this type of information and to kind of get a head start of where they're going and what's been done in the past.
Anyone else? Let's spend a little bit of time on the data and monitoring. There were several ideas in the chat for good databases. We just had a new question. Would you care to read your question out loud, Michelle?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Thank you. So someone said earlier that we are not valuing the data that we already have. And I'm paraphrasing the person, but they said that there's data monitoring data that we can't use unless it's approved by the right people. I think the person said unless it's stamped by academia or something like that. Forgive me if I'm not quoting you correctly. So I guess I was hoping someone could elaborate more on that about what data we can and can't use. So it's sounding like, is it that we're only supposed to use peer-reviewed data, or can we also use unpublished data? And how does that work? So I'm asking because I'm new to the agency and just trying to figure out the basics.
So that was myself that made that comment. And yeah, I don't know that there's a specific policy, but there's I don't know, like I said, I don't know if it's a unwritten rule, but yeah, if it's not peer reviewed, stamped by somebody who has a certain title, it just doesn't get included at all. Even though it's there, it doesn't get included. So it's challenging to use that stuff that might have 20 or 30 years of some kind of data from a local district that just it hasn't been ever put up there. So I don't know if it's a policy or not, but that seems to be when we're doing NEPA. It's like, no, that won't hold up to NEPA to anyone who's going to sue us. So
Okay, thank you.
Shala, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I wanted to say, so Michelle, we can use gray reports and non-peer-reviewed information as well, but it's all in how you share it and cite it, right? Like, I think a lot of entities are sitting on a lot of data that they've never even really written up, and this kind of gets back to the knowledge piece. People who are really experienced may have a lot of knowledge, but it isn't all pulled together in a format. And I think too that instead of telling our story well in a NEPA document, we frequently write NEPA to avoid litigation. Instead of writing NEPA, people can understand about what we're trying to do. And I think that sometimes I think sometimes that takes away from what Scott was getting at, which is, telling that story with data. Now, maybe if you have to make a decision between how you're going to implement something, maybe you'll lean one way or the other. But I use monitoring data and gray literature all the time to inform processes that we're writing or talking about. And it's real. We use the best available information we have. And sometimes that's not published or peer reviewed. We would get nothing done if we only stuck with published and peer reviewed data on certain subjects because it hasn't been collected yet. So I think part of the issue is data management. And so a lot of that data that, Scott was talking about, and I can't say to Scott's data in particular, but knowing, Pepe and I went through literally file cabinets at Forest Service district offices trying to collect some monitoring data that happened over a long course of time. And there was a protocol to follow and there was all this information, and yet nobody followed it the same. Everybody did it different, and none of that information was really able to be used. And that obviously costs the agency a lot of money But that should have been a huge learning opportunity, right? For how we do better and how we make sure someone is managing that data that's sitting in file cabinets and getting it in a position where it can be reviewed and looked at and incorporated into documents. But I also, and this is Shala Headwell, non-Fish and Wildlife Service employee speaking, think we need to do a better job writing for our audience and putting the information we have into there in a way that's understandable and not writing entirely just to respond to past court cases or anything else. I think if we do that, we will meet all the requirements the courts have put on us. So there's my soapbox.
Thanks, everyone. We have time for just one more. This question kind of combines the monitoring issue and the wildfire versus prescribed fire. Is there more funding, or is it easier or more doable in some ways to monitor wildlife after wildfire versus prescribed fire? What are the differences?
I'd like to,
Jamie, go for it.
there's certainly challenges with both. And the challenge with wildfire is you don't know exactly when it's going to happen and where. So getting that pre-data is challenging. You can use proxies looking at a whole landscape and time since fire and that sort of thing. From the prescribed fire, I think the challenge is also knowing exactly when things are going to happen. For example, this summer we had some some acoustic recorders out, and we thought a certain time it was going to be burned and we were good. And then, things change as the conditions change on the ground. And so we had to pull those out pretty fast or else they would be burned. So I think there's challenges on both sides. ARUs are fine. Go ahead.
I would say back, I think part of the question was, is the funding different? The funding is limited on both sides. There's more funding now for the prescribed fire side, but there really isn't a exact funding mechanism on the wildfire side. It just has to fall on as an extra duty to our already, overworked or overburdened, biologists, for example. The wildfire happens, and then, oh, now this is on your plate now, and they're trying to monitor for the prescribed fire, but now they have to add post monitoring for the wildfire that was unexpected. So it's always just a challenge from both the funding and, I think, manpower standpoint.
Pause just one more moment. Any closing thoughts on that point or anything else? We're seeing a few more comments.
I wanted to add one more thing to that. I'm always thinking about designs that are gonna take those challenges into account. So how do you have just enough spatial coverage, even if you don't know something is going to happen from a monitoring perspective, because that's reality.
And the good news on that is we have more tools today than we did 10, 15 years ago to use to get at that spatial distribution in a more cost-effective way. Acoustic monitoring devices, there's lots of different ARUs out there, cameras, all sorts of tools that we have now that we could be more thoughtful and collaborative in how we deploy them across the landscape or landscapes to get at Jamie's point. I think is really, really important. I also think, as painful as it is to say this, we're not going to have every answer for every species. And people need to get comfortable with calculated, informed risk. And that might be a good subject for a discussion moving forward too, because we are moving forward. And so we have information we can use. We know a lot about the vegetation, a lot. And I think we could do a better job, again, using the information we have. We won't always be right, but then we'll have that monitoring system in place that Jamie's running to answer that question to improve our ability to move. We are not going to know everything, and yet we are still going to need to do something. That something is putting fire on the landscape.
Incomplete knowledge.
Yep.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the panelists and to Shella and Jamie for helping to organize the panel. Thank you for the great questions. If we did not get to your question, we did record it. We will share it back in the meeting notes and also think about how to incorporate it in future components of this webinar series and year-long process. So with that, let's all take a little stretch break and convene back at 3:01.